Hello everyone, and today I'm very pleased to be here with Professor Alberto Alemanno. So Professor Alemanno is the Jean Monnet Professor of EU Law at HEC Paris. He's also the founder of the Good Lobby. He's currently a Democracy Fellow at Harvard University and also a permanent visiting fellow at the University of Tokyo, amongst other visiting appointments. So we're very pleased to have you here, and thanks for being with us, Professor Alemanno.
Thank you for having me.
So a lot of your work focuses on the democratic quality of governance, right? And specifically here today, we're focusing on the European Union. So, I mean, just to start off with a kind of a broad question, do you think that the EU is sufficiently democratic?
I got very much interested in this question in the past 20 years as a European citizen. I've been asking, what kind of role should I play as an inhabitant of Europe? And despite having spent a lot of time thinking and writing about this issue, my answer is not a clear yes or no. I think the democratic qualities of Europe are very different than those of the nation state. And that's why it's a fantastic research question, but also an action research, because we need to understand exactly what kind of role citizens may play into the European Union. And I think to do so, we need to go back in history and try to understand how these states came together and decided to somehow give up on their sovereignty to create a space where citizens were somehow entitled to new rights. They were benefiting from new opportunities, while at the same time not being fully in control of that particular democratic process, which paradoxically was reducing their self-democratic participation at the national level. So your question is very central to what the European Union is and what it should be in the near future.
Okay, so I mean, you're right. You've kind of described a paradox, right? Because since its inception, I mean, you talk about being a European citizen, right? And so you consider that a meaningful category, and it is a meaningful category, right? But there's this paradox that the European Union, since its inception, it gives citizens rights, but not necessarily many avenues or many meaningful avenues of democratic participation. And so you said that we need to look to history for the answers. And why was that? Was democracy or democratic participation not really a concern of the founders of what was then the European community?
Well, the European project was established in the absence of citizens. The citizens don't appear anywhere. It was an international treaty concluded among countries that basically was democracy for the people. Not by the people or of the people. So the idea was we come together to deliver for citizens, for the residents of Europe. We're going to create better conditions for them, but there should be a trade-off. Europeans are not going to be directly affected in terms of bottom-up participation, but they're going to be on the beneficial side. That's what we call output legitimacy. So legitimacy of the European Union will deliver on what they actually do to citizens. But of course, over time, this idea has been questioned because it was pretty clear that given the level of social and economic integration occurring across borders, with more and more millions of people living across border, that at some point this kind of demand for input legitimacy would have emerged. In particular, because the competencies, meaning the power the European Union has been gaining over time, has increased, and therefore the impact on our life has increased. And by now, at least 2 generations of Europeans have been affected as much as by the European decision as those taken by their national capitals. And I think this is why in 2025, 2026 is so important to ask those questions, because clearly the EU is expected to do more and will do more for citizens, while not necessarily creating equivalent opportunity for citizens to have a voice. And are there opportunities for citizens? Well, the answer is yes. Since the 1950s, citizens can, formally speaking, not only send their representatives, initially indirectly elected, so the members of parliaments were going to Strasbourg in the European Parliament, and since 1979 directly elected into the European Parliament, but also through their governments, which are also directly elected, at least in each national capital. But in addition to these forms of representative democracy, we also have participatory democracy. So since the 50s, we have the right to petition. Citizens can petition the European Parliament, raise issues. We often call them orphan issues nobody cares about, stemming or deriving from the impact of the EU on citizens' life. And those citizens can actually enter into the policy cycle, at least theoretically. However, the uptake of the petitions is very limited. We are talking about a few thousand people per year. And this has been giving rise to many more citizens' opportunities, including public consultations, complaints to the European Commission, complaints to the European Ombudsman, but also the European citizen initiatives that allow 7 European citizens coming from 7 European countries to suggest new initiatives, new policies to the European Union. So on paper, these opportunities exist. They are little known, and as a result, they are little used. But when they could actually make a difference. And my counterfactual research question over time has always been how Europe would look like if more European citizens would own and use those kind of input that come from the bottom and would somehow shape and force European political parties as well as the European institutions and governments to position themselves on those demands.
Yeah, okay. And I want to focus a bit more on a couple of the institutions in particular, because you mentioned some of the major, so direct forms of, representative democracy is through voting for the European elections. And then the major form of indirect is participating in national elections and whatnot, sending representatives to the Council. So you've got the European Parliament for direct, the Council for indirect, but then, of course, this leaves the Commission, which you did mention. And importantly, of course, it's the Commission that initiates legislative proposals, right? So you mentioned some of these initiatives and ways that the Commission is trying to seek input. Maybe you could say a bit more about those and whether you consider that the Commission is doing enough of that. I mean, what is the Commission doing to try to get a sense of the breadth and depth of opinion on the issues on which it proposes legislation?
Historically, the European Commission has been the only institution tasked to identify the European interest as opposed to the sum of national interest. And therefore, it has been entrusted with the authority to be basically the only one that can initiate something new, a new policy, a new initiative, because that's the power the European Commission has, which is very problematic from a democratic standpoint, because when we think through the nation eyes, we always expect the parliament to be the one putting forward new proposal. Well, this is not the case in Europe. We need to look at the European Commission. So the Commission has been emerging as the supranational institution capable of identifying those interests, putting onto the table proposals, and then asking the parliament and the member governments, so what you said, the two co-legislators in the European Union, they need to agree in order to have this policy transform. And we know that empirically 95% in average of these proposals become law and only 5% are withdrawn. So the Commission owns a lot of power, which has been used over time. But of course, the question is where the Commission derives its own legitimacy, to what extent it is open to input coming from the outside world. Again, historically, we have always been thinking about the Commission as a unique body capable of somehow identifying all these general interests without necessarily looking at its link with the parliament or links with the European governments. But in reality, we have been witnessing a sort of parliamentarization of the process. Since 2009, we see that the European Commission can only sit into power, so become the European Commission itself after receiving a positive vote of the European Parliament. So this link has parliamentarized the European Commission vis-à-vis a political majority, which is de facto emerging within that particular European Parliament. So in essence, the Commission has to deliver on the political priority emerging from the European Parliament, which in turn derives from the political preferences expressed in a pan-European way through the European election. In addition, if citizens mobilize and they ask, for instance, to end the use of cage for farming animals, for breeding animals, or if they ask the European Commission to stop international roaming charges, or to impose an obligation on manufacturers of video games to retrieve all of them because they represent waste for the planet, the Commission might consider them. And if there's 1 million signatures collected, then it has to position itself. If you look at the legacy of this European Citizen Initiative in the last 13, 14 years, we have been seeing over 120 ECIs registered. Out of them, 15 have reached 1 million.
Okay.
And none of them has translated into a legislative initiative per se. Okay. There have been some communications, there have been some ideas which have been feeding in pending proposals, but none per se has translated into an actual legislative action. So the question is, what if instead of having 150 registered, we would have had thousands or hundreds of thousands. This would have probably increased the pressure on the Commission to be more responsive to citizens' demand, and therefore to adapt the way in which it identifies political priorities and to be more open-minded about this.
But so, I mean, why don't we have thousands and hundreds of thousands? I mean, is it just that Europeans don't know? And I mean, is this going back to a kind of a bigger problem of citizens feeling, even though their lives are massively impacted by the European Union, that they feel too far removed?
I think research suggests that there are several structural conditions that limit the ability of citizens to exercise this democratic self-determination. I would say the first one is historical. We know that European integration entails a form of protection from the expression of popular sovereignty because of what happened during the Second World War. And therefore, the Commission has always been a bit suspicious of any attempt at somehow imposing some will of the majority or willing of those of mobilize on itself. Then there is, I would say, a second more sociocultural reasons, which has to do with the literacy that Europeans have vis-à-vis the European Union. The Union suffers from a democratic intelligibility deficit, meaning that we don't really see how that machine works because it's so different from what the member states. And as we just said in our conversation, we cannot expect the same institution to play the same role. And this is very disorienting. Then there is a third one, which is a bit more instrumental, the fact that the national political class had no incentive whatsoever to actually foster greater dialogue between the citizens and the European institutions, because in a way they are the intermediary of this transnational democratic space. And then there is a fourth one, which I think has to do with the way in which the European Union has been perceived as something really far apart, where only the governments can call the shot and there's no space for citizens. But this is exactly what is changing now, given the increasing impact of policy action or inaction coming from the European Union. And therefore the expectations by citizens, a growing number of citizens, are actually turning into pressure on the European Union to justify itself when it does something or it fails to do something, which might potentially be a game changer. In 2025, we see a record high number of ECI, European Citizen Initiative, registered. We see more initiatives having to do not only with new initiatives, but also the ECI is used as a tool to lobby, meaning to exercise influence on pending files, being on consumer rights, being on the Green Deal, so the fact that the European Union is rolling back on its sustainability commitment. So we see both organized civil society and citizen movements reclaiming those tools as the only remaining way for them to gain a say into the European integration process.
Okay. I want to pick up on a phrase you just used, which was transnational democratic space. And my question really is, do you think there is a transnational democratic space in the EU? But I'm thinking, particularly in relation to what came up before about the European Parliament and elections to the Parliament, because, of course, in many ways, this is still like 27, European, not quite national elections, but 27 versions of the EU elections coming together to, but so do you see, and to what extent do you think that there is a transnational democratic space?
Well, structurally speaking, the European Union suffers from the absence of a European political system. There is not a European political party system. There's not an electoral system at the European-wide level as it should be. Instead, we see that on European Elections Day, we don't have all Europeans voting on the same day, which is surprising. There is no European Election Day. The Dutch vote on Thursday, the Belgian on Saturday, most of the people on Sunday. But more critically, they actually vote, or they are called upon to vote, national parties in their own country of origin, running on national political agendas, running candidates who come from the very same country. In other words, there's nothing European in the European elections. We see 27 parallel processes that, once concluded, will send to the European Parliament national politicians who have not been campaigning on European issues. And this issue is really a stumbling block in the transnationalization of the democratic space of the European Union, which could only be addressed through major European-wide reforms, starting from an electoral system that incentivizes national political leaders to come together and to indicate, for instance, in the ballot box, which is the European political party of reference.
Yes.
European political parties exist, but they are not visible, they are not recognizable by the average voter, because first of all, they don't appear on the ballot box. Only once these national candidates are elected and become members of European Parliament, only at that time they're going to be asked to share or at least disclose their allegiance vis-a-vis one of these European political parties. And this is too little and too late. Yes. So European political parties tend to be much more heterogeneous as compared to national political parties. They are not all accountable on their positions, so they can vote very differently among themselves as members of the same political group. And this has no major political consequences. So this is structurally very, very problematic. Having said so, I think there is inevitably an incipient emergence of a transnational political space because many national political issues are somehow related to the European Union. In other words, there are cleavages within member states that transcend their borders. In an event, every single country now has to discuss the same challenges, ranging from climate to now defense and protection and geopolitical transformation that are occurring in Europe, which force national political parties to somehow say or tell or disclose where they stand on European issues. This is relatively recent. Everything started with the financial crisis, sovereign crisis, 2008, 2012. But I think now we have been seeing an acceleration of that process that I do call a Europeanization of the political space. So I see that unless these political issues transcend the national borders, it won't be possible, neither through structural reforms nor from bottom-up initiatives, to actually create the seeds for this demand for greater voice, citizens' voice, within and across the European Union.
But I mean, a lot of this politicization has been coming from the kind of Eurosceptical side of things, right? And contesting a lot of what the EU does and what it stands for and identity issues. I mean, many people may see this as damaging for the European project, and an alternative view is that any politicization is good politicization. So do you have a view on that?
Yeah, you pinpoint to a very significant paradox, the fact that ethno-national forces, those pushing for the national interest, are those that have been doing a better job at transnationalizing their message by being the first to come together, creating political groups that have at least apparently a common appeal, they have a common slogan, they have a common push. But at the same time, obviously their end game is not Europeanization, is rather renationalization and reclaiming competence from the European Union. But you're right, they've been doing a greater job than the pro-European camp, which has instead been speaking the words of Europeanization without necessarily practicing it today. I belong to those who believe that any forms of politicization across the European Union is good enough to prompt the conditions for finally owning this European political space that today belongs to anyone, if not to those who are against the EU project per se. And therefore, I remain hopeful that in the coming months and years, we're going to be seeing more and more political parties organizing across borders in order to gain greater relevance within the European Union. The very same European Commission, the very same European political balance, to say, within the European Parliament and Council, show increasingly more Europeanization of issues, not less. But this is not translating into the political offer, which remains very much across national political boundaries, whereas the political demand for, I would say, political Europe is growing due to external, mainly circumstances and crises, which have been chasing the European project in the past 20 years.
Yes. Now, just before we finish up, I do want to ask you about your work with the Good Lobby, which you founded in 2009, right? And because this goes to what we've been talking about citizen involvement. So, I mean, what is it that you're trying to do with the Good Lobby?
Well, in parallel to my research and scholarship work, I felt that as an academic, I wanted to get my hands dirty in providing support to civil society organization by being a bit an evangelist of these channels of participation, by creating more opportunities for them to gain a seat at the table, because a further features of the European Union as we know it is also a very limited access to power due to the limited literacy, due to the fact that it's not very well known, and the EU is very centralized in Brussels, and these institutions look very dark and opaque. It is very important to level the playing field. So the commitment of our organization, the mission of our organization, is to equalize access to power by creating the opportunities for everyone, from vulnerable groups to citizens movements and organized civil society, to actually shape the policy process, which tends to be much more technocratic, evidence-based, at least on paper, than the one we witness at the national level across OECD countries, but which at the very same time misses the point, because too often it privileges the voices of those who have a louder voice in relation to those who don't. So in a way, our dream at the Good Lobby is to disappear one day once our mission is going to be completed, because virtually every interest will have the chance to be heard. But that's not exactly what policymakers do. Policymakers in the institutions in Brussels, like anywhere else, they like to meet those stakeholders who have more evidence, who are more professionalized, who are not plain speaking, but they are rather complex and sophisticated, and providing the ammunitions for the policy process to continue. So we are really trying to advocate for a more transparent, a more accountable, more responsible use of lobbying as a legitimate form of participation. They should be open to everyone. So we basically argue that we need more lobbying, not less lobbying, which is a bit counterintuitive by making such an argument and trying to fix this systemic issue, which is really that of access to power in a transnational democracy, which is even more complex than at the national level.
Okay, and a very final question, and I'm sorry because it's a big one, so I put you on the spot a bit, but all these deficiencies notwithstanding, are you optimistic about the EU's future?
I remain optimistic, in particular when I look at the new generation, when I look at the people who leave Europe, they take for granted all what we have been achieving. And when I look at their desire to somehow finally contribute to the project, I don't think we're seeing millions and millions of Europeans in the street pushing for more Europe, for greater Europe, whatever that means. But I see now enough elements that seem to suggest that we might have reached a point in which we could embark on a more mature debate. What kind of Europe we need? What do we want? Instead of simply talking about pro, anti, and just moving beyond this kind of dichotomies, which I think do not do justice to the realities of Europe on the ground, because the Europeanization has occurred in society, has occurred across economies, has occurred at so many different levels, but it doesn't occur at the political level. So the current developments, what is unfolding in these years of geopolitically shattering and transformation, are inevitably pushing Europe to a moment of truth. Either it will be able to catch up with its political system integrating a bit more than it has done so far, or the whole edifice will crumble because it will no longer be credible, it will no longer be capable of delivering. And this is the only source of legitimacy it decides to impose on itself. So it's a bit frustrating as a witness of integration and as a product of integration to see that the EU has almost deliberately and systematically give up on looking or seeking for this input legitimacy coming from the people. Even when it comes to membership, when the union is opening up and there are new members, countries coming in, it has never even bothered to consider what do people want in that country. Are they keen to join? So why to omit such an opportunity remains a bit puzzling to me, but this has to change, otherwise the next accession won't necessarily occur, because we are talking about over 10 countries we've been waiting in line for too long, and where the fatigue and the current geopolitical transformation are really holding back those countries from crafting a positive narrative for integration. Also because they have de facto become members, they already got so many deals and agreements and frameworks that at the end of the day, membership would not bring so much more to those countries.
Okay, well, I mean, there's a lot there that we'll have to get into another time, but thank you very much for taking the time to speak to us today, Professor Alemanno.
Thanks for having me.